Hello everyone who has come and listened. I am Jay. Today I would like to tell you a story. Veteran TV host fired after statement. Karoline Leavitt's response shocks America. Please listen. The night that changed everything. The stage was set for what seemed like another fiery but controlled debate on the American spotlight, one of the most watched political talk shows in the country. Millions of viewers tuned in, expecting a night of sharp exchanges, heated arguments, and the usual back and forth between the host and his guest. But no one, not the producers, not the audience, and certainly not James Amory himself, could have predicted that this night would be the one to end his career. James Amory was a household name, a seasoned journalist with over 2 decades of experience grilling politicians and holding power to account. He had built his reputation on his no-nonsense style, his relentless questioning, and his ability to put even the most polished public figures on the defensive. But tonight, his opponent was different. Sitting across from him, under the bright studio lights, was Karoline Leavitt, a rising conservative firebrand, former White House press secretary, and one of the most formidable voices on the right. The topic of the night: is the media truly fair, or is it just a tool for shaping narratives? It was the kind of debate that had been held 100 times before. But this time, the stakes felt different. America was more polarized than ever. Trust in the mainstream media had eroded, and viewers weren't just looking for entertainment, they were looking for confirmation of their deepest suspicions. The opening minutes played out as expected. James, in his signature confident tone, welcomed Karoline and framed the discussion. "Karoline, thank you for joining us tonight," he said, flipping through his carefully prepared notes. "I know our audience is eager to hear your perspective." Karoline met his gaze with a composed smile. "Thank you, James. I'm looking forward to an open and honest discussion. This is an important conversation, especially in an era where information spreads faster than ever before." James smirked slightly. "You're absolutely right," he said, leaning forward. "But that also forces us to ask a bigger question. Is the media really reporting objectively, or has it become a weapon used by those with a vested interest?" Karoline didn't blink. "I believe the media should serve as a mirror to the truth, neutral and unbiased. But in reality, we've all seen how certain stories dominate headlines while others are buried, despite their significance." James's expression sharpened. "Are you implying that there's a systematic bias in the media?" Karoline nodded. "At this point, it's no longer an assumption. It's an undeniable reality." The tension in the room thickened. The audience could sense it. The producers could feel it. The stage was set, and the battle had just begun. The fatal mistake. James Amory had been here before. Countless times. He had gone toe-to-toe with presidents, CEOs, and political heavyweights, pushing them to their limits, exposing their flaws, and walking away with his reputation intact. He had never lost control. Not once in over 2 decades. But tonight, something was different. He could feel it. It wasn't just Karoline Leavitt's composure that was getting to him. It was the way she countered his every argument with precision, the way she never flinched, never gave him the reaction he was looking for. The way she sat there, so self-assured, so unshaken by his sharpest questions, was beginning to gnaw at him. The debate had started like any other. James, as always, played the role of the skeptical journalist, challenging Karoline's claims about media bias, pushing her to justify every word. But with each response, she tightened her grip on the conversation. Instead of scrambling for answers, she let his questions sit in the air for a moment, measured her words carefully, and delivered responses that made it sound like she was the one in control. James felt it slipping. His audience was starting to lean in her direction. He could see it in the live feed monitors. The comments flooding in were mixed, but the trend was clear. She's making sense. She's not backing down. Why is James pushing so hard? And then, the worst part, the one thing he dreaded the most. The producers weren't giving him signals. They weren't whispering suggestions through his earpiece. They weren't cutting to a commercial break. They weren't helping him out of this tightening noose. They were letting it play out. Because they knew. They could feel it too. This wasn't just another debate. This was turning into something far bigger. James took a steadying breath, trying to regain his footing. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice, making it sound intimate, like a teacher explaining something to a naive student. "Karoline, let's be honest," he said, his smile thin. "You and people like you always talk about media bias, about conservatives being treated unfairly. But tell me, who really controls the narrative? Who truly holds the power here?" There, the shift. A barely perceptible pause in the air. The studio was silent. The audience was waiting. And then, Karoline tilted her head ever so slightly. "People like me," she repeated, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. James blinked. He realized too late that he had stepped too far. But he couldn't backpedal now. His pride wouldn't allow it. His instincts told him to double down. "You know exactly what I mean," he said, pushing forward. "Conservatives. The ones who constantly complain about being silenced when in reality they are the ones controlling the conversation." There it was. A moment of pure, unfiltered frustration bleeding into his words. A slight edge of irritation slipping into his voice. A fatal mistake. Karoline's expression didn't change. She simply let his words settle, let them echo in the silence of the studio, let the audience absorb them in real time. Then, in a voice so controlled it sent a chill through the air, she asked, "Would you care to clarify what you mean by that?" James clasped his hands together. He could feel the sweat on his palms now. He tried to play it off, flashing a tight smile, but he knew. He knew. The producers in the control room exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, gripping a clipboard, muttered under his breath, "Did he really just say that?" Karoline was still watching him. The cameras were still rolling. The audience was still listening. James knew he had two choices. He could de-escalate, pull back, soften his tone, or he could push forward and hope to regain control of the room. He chose wrong. "I'm saying," he continued, his voice just a little sharper than before, "that conservatives pretend to be victims when, in fact, they manipulate the narrative, cast themselves as the oppressed to avoid accountability." Another silence, this one even heavier than before. Somewhere in the control room, a junior producer grabbed his headset and muttered, "Oh shit." Karoline inhaled slowly. Then, with a calmness that was almost chilling, she responded, "Are you saying conservatives don't contribute to society?" James opened his mouth to reply, but for the first time he hesitated. Because now he wasn't sure how to answer. Because now the conversation had left his control. He saw the flicker of realization in Karoline's eyes, the moment she understood she had won. And then, just to make sure he couldn't walk back his words, she asked again, her voice barely above a whisper, but somehow louder than anything else in the room. "Would you like to repeat that?" James swallowed. The weight of his own words settled in his chest like a stone. In the control room, the executive producer rubbed his temples. Someone else muttered, "This isn't going away." And James Amory? James Amory sat there, frozen in the moment that had just cost him everything. The storm begins. The moment James Amory's words left his mouth, he knew something had gone terribly wrong. The air in the studio had changed. It was subtle at first, just a pause, a slight shift in energy, but it was enough. The silence stretched a second too long, and in that second James felt it. The weight of his mistake sinking in. Karoline Leavitt wasn't reacting with outrage. She wasn't raising her voice or slamming the table. She didn't need to. Instead, she leaned back slightly, folded her hands in front of her, and let his words hang in the air. It was almost as if she was giving him time to realize what he had just done. And he did. But there was no taking it back. In the control room, the producers were frozen. One of them, gripping a clipboard so tightly his knuckles turned white, looked at the executive producer. "What do we do?" he whispered. The executive producer didn't answer. He was watching the screen, eyes wide, as James Amory, one of the most untouchable figures in political journalism, sat there, visibly rattled. Back in the studio, Karoline finally broke the silence. Her voice was calm, too calm. "Would you like to repeat that, James?" James forced a chuckle, trying to regain control, but it came out wrong, too forced, too nervous. "I think my point is clear, Karoline," he said, his voice a fraction shakier than before. Karoline tilted her head slightly, her gaze never wavering. "Oh, it's very clear," she said, crystal clear. At that moment, James felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Fear. Not the kind of fear that came from tough interviews or heated debates. This was something else. Something deeper. The fear of knowing that the ground beneath him had just shifted, and there was no solid footing left. And then, the real nightmare began. The moment the segment ended, the control room exploded into chaos. Phones rang non-stop. Emails flooded in. Social media was already ablaze. James barely had time to remove his earpiece before a junior producer rushed up to him, pale and shaking. "James, we have a problem," she said, her voice unsteady. He didn't need to check his phone to know what was happening, but when he did, his stomach twisted. Twitter was already flooded with clips of the exchange. Hashtags like "Fire James Amory" and "Media Bias Exposed" were trending at lightning speed. But the worst part, the part that made his breath hitch, was that the clip wasn't showing the full conversation. It was just him. Just his words. Conservatives pretend to be victims when in fact they manipulate the narrative, cast themselves as the oppressed to avoid accountability. That was it. No context, no lead-up, no Karoline's response. Just that one sentence, stripped of everything around it, turned into a rallying cry for outrage. James's pulse pounded in his ears. He turned to one of the network's senior executives, who was already on a call, his expression grim. "They're pulling ads," the executive muttered into the phone, rubbing his temples. 3 sponsors already, maybe more. James felt his throat go dry. This wasn't just backlash. This was a full-blown media wildfire, and it was spreading fast. The fall of James Amory. James Amory sat in his office, his fingers clenched around his phone as notifications flooded his screen. He could barely keep up with the avalanche of messages, emails, and news alerts. Just 24 hours ago, he was one of the most respected journalists in the country. Now, his name was plastered across every headline for all the wrong reasons. James Amory's career in freefall. Veteran host under fire for controversial remarks. Chaff Fire James Amory takes over social media. His heart pounded in his chest as he scrolled through Twitter. That clip had been shared millions of times. But it wasn't just the words he had spoken. It was the way it was framed. A 5-second soundbite, stripped of all context, played on a loop with captions that made him look like a villain. Maybe if conservatives spent less time complaining and more time actually contributing, that one line. Over and over. It didn't matter what he had meant, what he had said before or after. It didn't matter that he had been trying to challenge Karoline Leavitt's argument. Not insult half the country. None of it mattered. Perception was reality. And the reality was James Amory was in freefall. The backlash hits hard. His phone rang, snapping him out of his daze. It was his producer. James hesitated before answering. "James, we need to talk," came the voice on the other end, tense and hurried. James swallowed hard. "I know," he said, rubbing his temple. "What's the damage?" There was a pause. That was never a good sign. "It's bad," the producer admitted. 3 major sponsors pulled out this morning. More are threatening to follow. The network is in full-blown crisis mode. James closed his eyes. He had spent years building relationships with these sponsors, ensuring the American spotlight was a financial powerhouse. Now, in the span of a few hours, it was unraveling. "The executives are having an emergency meeting in an hour," the producer continued. "They're discussing your future with the network." James opened his eyes. His jaw tightened. "You mean they're deciding whether to fire me?" Silence. That was all the confirmation he needed. His grip on the phone tightened. "This is insane," he hissed. "They know who I am. They know I'm not some extremist. I've given them 20 damn years, and they're going to throw me away over one sentence?" The producer sighed. It's not just the sentence, James. It's the optics. The sponsors don't care about context. They care about their image. And right now, being associated with you is bad for business. James felt his stomach churn. He had covered political scandals his entire career. He had seen politicians, CEOs, and celebrities destroyed overnight by the court of public opinion. He had reported on it, analyzed it, picked apart their missteps. And now he was the one under the microscope. The network turns its back. The emergency meeting was brutal. James sat at the long glass conference table staring down the network executives, their expressions grim. "We've weighed all possible options," one of them said. "And given the ongoing backlash, the loss of advertisers, and the risk to our reputation, we've come to a decision." James clenched his jaw. He already knew what was coming. "As of today," the executive continued, "you are no longer employed by this network." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had prepared himself for this moment, told himself he was ready. But hearing it out loud made it real. He exhaled sharply. "That's it?" he said, his voice tight. "After everything I've done for this company? After 20 years, you're just cutting me loose?" Another executive, someone he had once considered a friend, shifted uncomfortably. "James, it's not personal." "The hell it's not," James snapped. "You're firing me to save yourselves." Silence. No one argued. Because it was true. He looked around the room, searching for even a hint of loyalty, a shred of resistance to the mob that was tearing him apart online. He found none. Finally, he let out a bitter laugh. "You know what?" he said, pushing back his chair and standing. "Screw all of you." Without another word, he grabbed his phone, turned on his heel, and walked out of the building for the last time. The final blow. The moment he stepped outside, the flash of cameras nearly blinded him. Reporters swarmed, microphones thrust in his face. "James, do you have a statement? Do you regret your comments? What's next for you?" James ignored them all. He pushed through the crowd, his heartbeat roaring in his ears. His phone buzzed again. Another notification. This time it was Karoline Leavitt's. She had just tweeted. She hadn't called for his firing. She hadn't gloated or given an interview. Instead, she had simply retweeted the viral clip with a single emoji. James stared at the screen, feeling a cold dread settle in his chest. Because now it wasn't just about losing his job. It was about losing control of his own name. His words no longer belonged to him. And that was the scariest part of all. The comeback. A man with nothing to lose. James Amory sat alone in his dimly lit study, the only sound in the room, the rhythmic ticking of an antique clock on the wall. The past 72 hours had been the longest of his life. His career was over. The network had erased him, stripped his name from their archives, and distanced themselves from his controversial remarks. The sponsors had pulled out. The media, including his former colleagues, had turned their backs. But it wasn't just about losing his job. It was the realization that he no longer owned his own words. That 5-second clip, that damn 5-second clip, was still everywhere. It played on an endless loop across every platform. No context, no nuance, just those few words repeated over and over until they became something else entirely. James had spent his life dissecting public meltdowns, analyzing how scandals unfolded, how narratives were shaped, and how people fell. He had believed himself to be immune, but now he knew. No one was immune. And yet, something inside him refused to accept that this was the end. His phone buzzed. He hesitated before glancing at the screen. It was a text from a longtime friend in the industry, one of the few who hadn't abandoned him completely. "James, the network wants this to disappear. They think you'll fade into obscurity. Are they right?" His jaw tightened. No. They were not right. James reached for his laptop, fingers hovering over the keyboard. His pulse steadied. The fear, the humiliation, the anger, it all coalesced into something sharp. A plan. The Callaway Report. An unfiltered war. Within hours, a new Twitter account went live. A single tweet appeared from it. "The Amory Report. The truth cannot be silenced. We're just getting started." Beneath it was a link to a brand new website. Those who clicked found a video, Not a high-production broadcast, not a polished news segment, but a simple, raw recording of James Amory sitting in his study, speaking directly to the camera. His expression was calm, but his eyes burned with something that had been missing in his final days at the American spotlight. Conviction. I lost my job over a single sentence. But this isn't just about me. This is about something far bigger. Who controls the truth? Who gets to decide what's acceptable speech and what isn't? He leaned forward. You've all seen how fast a career can be destroyed. One sentence. One moment. That's all it takes. But ask yourselves, how many times has this happened before? How many voices have been silenced because they dared to challenge the wrong people? James let the question hang before continuing. I was a part of that machine. I know how it works. I know how the media manipulates stories, twists narratives, and buries inconvenient truths. And now, for the first time in 20 years, I am free to expose it. The video ended with a simple call to action. If you want the truth, if you want real reporting, join me. The Amory Report is just beginning. Within minutes, the tweet went viral. The response was immediate. Some called him a grifter, a bitter man trying to cling to relevance. Others saw him as a martyr, a victim of cancel culture fighting back. But one thing was certain. People were listening. Karoline Leavitt's silence speaks louder than words. While James Amory fought to reclaim his name, Karoline Leavitt stayed silent. She hadn't given interviews. She hadn't written op-eds. She hadn't gone on a victory tour. She didn't need to. Her single tweet, the thinking emoji, still hovered over the internet like an unanswered question. It had been retweeted over 100,000 times. People debated its meaning. Was she mocking James? Was she implying he had dug his own grave? Or was she simply watching, waiting, letting the world decide? And that, perhaps, was the most powerful move of all. Because while James was fighting to redefine himself, Karoline didn't need to fight at all. She had already won. And the war had only just begun. The war for truth. James Amory sat in front of his camera, staring at the blinking red light. It was just him now. No studio, no producers, no network executives deciding what could or couldn't be said. Just a man and his words, unfiltered and raw. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind. The fallout from his firing hadn't died down. It had only evolved. He was no longer just a disgraced TV host. He had become something else entirely, a symbol of the war between traditional media and independent voices. But was he the hero in this story? Or was he just another casualty? His name had been dragged through every news cycle, debated by pundits, dissected by online commentators. His supporters called him a martyr of cancel culture, a man wrongfully cast out for speaking the truth. His critics saw him as a bitter figure grasping at relevance, a man who had spoken recklessly and paid the price. The truth? James wasn't sure if the truth even mattered anymore. But he knew one thing. He refused to disappear. A shifting media landscape. The Amory Report had grown faster than even he expected. The website had crashed 3 times in the first week due to the overwhelming traffic. Donations poured in. Independent sponsors, ones who weren't afraid of public backlash, reached out, eager to fund his new platform. And yet, James felt a strange emptiness in his victories. This wasn't just about reclaiming his voice. It was about something bigger, something he had never truly understood until he became the target. For years, he had been part of the machine. He had sat on the other side of the table, questioning, pushing, sometimes even cornering his guests the way Karoline Leavitt had done to him. He had prided himself on exposing bias, calling out hypocrisy. Now, he had been the one exposed. And the irony of it all was that the very system he once defended had chewed him up and spit him out without a second thought. The woman who never had to say a word. Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt continued her rise. She hadn't needed to say much after that fateful debate. Her silence had been her greatest weapon. Every time she stepped onto a stage, every time she sat down for an interview, she carried the weight of that moment with her. It followed her like an unspoken badge of victory. She had faced James Amory, a man who had built his career on controlling conversations, and she had let him destroy himself, and she had done it without raising her voice. People admired her for it. Even those who didn't agree with her politics respected the way she had handled the storm. James knew this wasn't just about the past, it was about the future. The question that still remains. As James looked into the camera, he knew that the battle for public trust was far from over. The media was changing. The way people consumed news was evolving. The power was shifting. But to whom? To figures like Karoline, who had mastered the art of silence? To independent voices like himself, who had broken free from corporate control but still wrestled with their own biases? Or was the real power in the hands of the people? The viewers, the ones who clicked, shared, and shaped the narratives with every tweet and every comment. James exhaled slowly and hit record. Let's talk about the truth. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to like, share, and leave comments for the story.